The wind announced itself before sunrise, not as a howl at first, but as a steady pressure that pressed on windows and doors like an unseen crowd, and then turned sharp and tearing as sheets of rain came on in sudden bursts that made conversation pause mid-sentence. By daylight, Leyte had changed shape in the ways storms measure their passage. Rooftops twisted and peeled coconut trees cropped into splintered silhouettes, and electric posts snapped at uniform heights, as if some giant hand had simply pressed down along the roadside and broken them in sequence, leaving wire garlands draped over lanes, now choked with branches and zinc roofing. Evacuation centers, the same basketball courts and barangay halls that flex into shelter every typhoon season, filled with families carrying the practical mathematics of survival in plastic sacks. Birth certificates double-wrapped, a day's clothes, pots and rice, a transistor radio. And in the quiet between wind gusts, people traded quick updates. Where the water rose first, which alley went dark first, who had last seen the neighbor on crutches before the power went, and the phones turned to black mirrors. Power outages fell across wide swaths of Leyte, and the sudden silence of pumps meant tap water stopped with a final cough, leaving drums and gallon jugs to stand in for an entire utility. No timeline yet. The lineman said not until the gusts let them climb and the roads let them pass. And in the meantime, barangay text trees tried to work on rapidly draining phone batteries that became a currency of their own. Across the channel, the story in Cebu read like floodwater, rising, relentless, tracing low-lying neighborhoods that knew they were vulnerable, but hoped this time the water would stop at the third step and not the sixth. By mid-morning, waist-deep currents turned familiar streets into slow-moving rivers, marked only by the tops of parked vehicles and the occasional balcony where people waved for attention, a bright towel doubling as a signal flag. Rescuers in red and yellow vests steered rafts and improvised floaters with the patience that moving water demands, listening to the percussion of rain on corrugated roofs as they navigated alleys where gates were invisible beneath the brown surface. Counting heads by name and nickname, because in the midst of a storm, it is names, not numbers, that move people fastest. Airports posted lists of delayed and cancelled flights as the cyclone tallied multiple landfalls in its westward trek. Terminals filled with that tired mix of resignation and worry, while advisories pushed the same tune. Don't risk a last dash, better to ride this out in place than to test a bridge or a shoreline when wind charts and rainfall plots both say, wait. Earlier estimates had Tino pushing sustained winds in the 120-140 kph range, with gusts up to around 180 kph, depending on where you stood in its core and feeder bands. Enough power to break poles cleanly, to shear tree crowns, to lift roof panels and set them down 3 houses away like oversized playing cards thrown by a temperamental dealer. It's the kind of wind that also rearranges the invisible systems, grids, pipes, towers, on which everything else depends. So losing electricity often means losing water, and sometimes losing the signal that tells you when help is on the way. PAGASA briefings across the day framed the hazard plainly. Rain bands would keep spinning ashore. Gale-force winds along the coasts would make the sea stand up and lean toward the land, and storm surge remained a real line to watch for communities with memories of earlier seasons etched into seawalls and family stories. Even as the circulation arced toward the Sulu Sea corridor, the instruction was to treat the tail like a whip, dangerous even after the head has passed. In Southern Leyte, where landfall around midnight set the tone, the geography turned against the residents at precisely the wrong hour. The onshore winds stacked water and drove debris, while steep upland slopes, already saturated, moved from absorbing to shedding rain in a matter of hours. It was enough to send families toward the barangay halls, where warm bodies and dry floor space drew quick borders of safety amidst the noise. Local disaster officials counted evacuees and compiled priority lists, while keeping one ear on the radio chatter, food, potable water tarps and batteries rising to the top again and again. And the phrasing of national agencies reflected the balance that always exists in the first day. Validate casualties, carefully keep rescue and clearing teams safe, and give the public an honest view of the timeline without promising what the roads and weather would allow. Power restoration, everyone agreed, would be staggered. Backbone lines, then feeders, then households. The usual choreography that looks slow to those waiting under tarps, but is the only safe way to light a province back up. Toppled poles are not solved by a switch. They are solved by crews walking a line that the storm has tried to erase. Cebu's floods wrote their own sequence of decisions in the meantime. Who stays on the second floor and who is moved, what to carry on a raft besides the child and the medicine. Which street's current runs too fast to cross even with a rope and a wall to lean on. Rapid assessment teams catalog not just damage but movement. How water routed itself differently this time. How a drainage project helped here but needed an extension there. How a knee-high curb turned out to be the small hero of a particular block. The clipboards and camera phones of responders may seem like bureaucracy at a distance, but in the days after a flood, those notes are how generators, pumps, mobile charging hubs and food lines find their way past traffic cones and down to the doorsteps that need them, and those photos become the before and after ledger a city uses to plan where to be stronger the next time, because there is always a next time in an archipelago that meets 20 storms a year. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear why the caution persisted, despite the eye moving west. The atmosphere still had bands to unwind, and each spiral arm carried its own local emergency. A culvert that plugged with branches, a creek with just enough rise to lift a sedan off its tires, a slope that shrugged and slid without announcement. Hazard maps are useful, but during a typhoon, the map is the cloud deck overhead and the pitch of the rain against the tin. The watchwords repeated through official channels, flood, landslide, surge, and the advice stayed stubbornly simple, because simple is what helps when a household has to make choices under pressure. Stay clear of floodwater if possible. Treat or boil your water. Keep phones dry and on low power mode. Don't drive into standing water, no matter how familiar the road looks, and listen to the barangay captain's voice. Even if it carries bad news, because that voice is tied directly to the first responders you can to see yet. By evening, reports from Leyte emphasized the practical complications. Roads made impassable not only by fallen trees, but by wires that could not be hastily cut without making tomorrow. Repairs take twice as long. Rescuers and linemen know that sometimes the fastest route is not the best route, and you measure speed by safety when tired people are already one mistake closer to injury than they were at dawn. In the province, water interruption shifted from inconvenience to risk for vulnerable households, and the guidance grew more specific. Share stored water with neighbors who have infants and medication to dissolve, use bleach drops or boil when in doubt, and prioritize latrine hygiene, because outbreaks a week later can become the storm within the storm if early care slips. Meanwhile, flights ticked back slowly where conditions allowed, but cancellations continued around the Visayas as the Circulation ES rear flank pushed crosswinds across runways and rough water across ferry routes. The advisories said what experience already teaches travelers. If you are waiting in a terminal during a typhoon, you are safer than you would be on a road during a typhoon, even if patience is its own kind of storm to endure. In broadcasts and live streams from storm chasers who had staged in Leyte before the worst of the winds, observations of a tightening core and an eye trying to clear matched the on-the-ground feeling residents described. That eerie interval when rain slackens and the air seems to hold its breath before the next push. Those who have seen many storms know that quiet is often a hinge, not a finish. So preparations, generators checked flashlights, set doors braced, continued even when the sound dipped for a while. Through it all, PAGASA's bulletins kept their cadence, and the broader track converged on a familiar narrative arc. emerge over the Sulu Sea rake northern Palawan, and then angle west toward the edges of Southeast Asia, where another country was already preparing worst-case plans. Storms do not recognize borders, and their timelines are reminders that archipelagos and coasts share a language called weather. There is a moment in every typhoon where communities write the second half of the story, the part not driven by wind speed, but by coordination. The barangay that opens a second charging station because the first line wraps around the court. The sari-sari that rations candles rather than selling to the first 5 customers. The tricycle drivers who turn into messengers because they know which lanes are passable. None of these make headlines, but all of them keep someone safer, and the best measure of a response is often how quickly people start asking, "Who hasn't checked in yet?" rather than, "What did we lose?" Reports of fatalities and the careful process of verification hung over the day, numbers, with a gravity that pulled conversations toward quiet. The agencies said they were still validating, still counting, still searching, which meant families were still waiting. And that is the hardest task in a long day, when the body wants sleep, and the mind keeps replaying the sound of the wind, hand on the door. When the rain finally began to grey out into a softer drizzle, and the gusts came less frequently, it did not mean the danger was over, only that the danger had changed shape. Floodwater has inertia, and slopes remember rain longer than skies do. So the overnight watch is often the most important, the hours when lights are few and the mind negotiates with both fatigue and fear. In places like Abuyog and Silago, the next day tasks lined up in predictable rows. Sweep, shovel, check the roof, check the lines, queue for water, mark the wall where the flood reached so that rebuilding knows its benchmark, while officials map the corridors to open first, the ones that lead to hospitals, markets, and the clusters of evacuation centers where supplies would stretch furthest if trucks could only reach them. It is then that guidance matters most. If you have no power or water, conserve and treat. If you are coastal, do not return until told. If you have extra, bring it where the barangay says it will do the most good, because the difference between disorder and relief is often a single cue that moves in the right direction. The last lesson a day like this offers is not new, but it bears repeating. Storms write their first draft in wind and rain, and their final draft in the choices neighbors make. That is why this channel commits to pinning verified links to LGU and OCD advisories, to elevating needs lists from Leyte and Cebu, to amplifying safe donation channels, and to telling the granular stories that don't always fit in a headline, but do fit in a community. Memory of how it got through. Because the camera can show a snapped pole, but only the comments can reveal that 5 households on that block shared 1 generator to power a nebulizer and 2 phones through the night. If you can, leave your barangay, your current needs, and a safe contact below. If you have resources, note what and where. And as the circulation moves west over open water and the maps redraw themselves around Palawan and into the wider sea, remember that preparedness is a practice, recovery is a relay, and resilience is not a slogan, but a set of habits repeated quietly until the lights come back on and the taps run clear again.